8th grade, and you're looking at a mess in the United States. It's getting ripped apart, and I'm sure Dr. Dan's going to talk about it. I'll introduce James here in a minute, and he'll introduce Dr. Byrne. But as a 14-year-old born in 1968, I also played guitar. So I realized that the Vietnam War was ripping us apart. And at age 14, I started playing this way. I started going to the left. And I started playing the hippie songs. I started playing the protest songs. I started hanging out at the moratoriums. I started wearing the black band around my wrist, around my arm. At age 14, so I was not the draft age, but I was old enough to be aware of what was going on. The Tet offensive, obviously, Dr. Dan's going to talk about, changed the world. So 1968 is a huge year in my world, because we lost two of the people who I thought was going to save the United States, and I thought was going to bring us out of this horrible mess that we're in. As a 14-year-old, your heroes get assassinated. And then you get what happens a little bit later in the summer, which is an absolute travesty to the United States. I'm sure Dr. Dan's going to talk about that. So 1968 makes, I couldn't wait to be here, Dr. Dan. I mean, I'm telling you what, I didn't have a limit we do. Seriously. But when James said, I got an idea. Oh my gosh, James, my heart's already fast. So first of all, I'd like to introduce James, Dr. James McLeod from UAB. And he will introduce my guest, Dr. Dan Byrne.
1968 was really important for me as well. I took my first steps and was learning to walk. So thank you all so much for coming. Thank you for supporting the Southwestern Indiana Historical Society. I'm on the board of that excellent organization. Thank you for those of you who've been members for years. If you're not a member of the society, please consider becoming a member. We would love to have you and be part of our activities. Just very briefly, it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague and close friend, Dr. Dan Byrne. He's an associate professor of history at the University of Evansville, a very gifted teacher and a gifted scholar, and as you'll see, a very gifted lecturer as well. He was educated at the universities of Notre Dame and Georgetown, so he has come over from the dark side of Catholicism to the gentle hold of Methodism at the University of Evansville. Dan, his dissertation was at Georgetown on American foreign policy as it related to the French decolonization of Algeria. But at the UAB, he teaches courses in a wide range of American history mostly, including a course that includes the 1960s. He's been with us at the UAB since 2005, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Dan Byrne.
I'm going to start with a heartfelt thank you to Southwestern Indiana Historical Society and Willard Library, Pat, for inviting me, and for all of you for attending. This is where historians get, especially historians of my age, get nervous because, of course, we're talking about something close in history, and that means, of course, that some people in the audience are actually going to have lived the history, and that makes us a little bit challenged. When I did my job interview at University of Evansville, you might have heard of a guy named Dick Conley. Dick Conley was a philosophy professor, and I give my talk on Algeria, and he goes, you know, I studied that when I was in high school. And I was like, well, okay, you know more than that, right? So many of you may know more than that, and that's okay. I'm still going to give it a go. So, when we think about 1968, especially when we think about it in the kind of grander global context, we have to think about 1968 as a period in which the young people of the globe, not just of the United States, but of the globe, begin to basically, well, you might say, outpace or at least find the pace of change to be unsatisfactory. And so in 1968, youth around the world, right, and we're going to focus on a few parts of the world today, the youth around the world begin to push back against a system of oppression that they had seen emerging in various parts of the world, whether it's Latin America, Asia, Europe, Africa, or North America, the United States, and just everywhere around the world, Americans and foreigners are going to be pushing back. And what I wanted to start is to just kind of lay out what it is they're pushing back against. The pressures of modern society lead young people to begin to push back against oppressive systems of education, and the university systems, both in the United States and elsewhere, were perceived of as dated, oppressive, and teaching kind of arcane things. They're pushing back against their governments, which are non-responsive, they believe, or non-democratic in some cases, or authoritarian in other cases. They're pushing back against hierarchy. They're talking about a classless society, whether you're in France or whether you're in Mexico City or whether you're in Chicago. Young people are talking about this broader, kind of more egalitarian society in which class and hierarchical backgrounds break down. And they're also pushing back against the patriarchy. This is the emergence of the women's movement during the 1960s, the kind of second wave feminism that's going to take place, becomes a really important part of 1968 and the Youth Revolt. And young people, regardless of class, regardless of race, and regardless of gender, are all pushing back against these systems of oppression that they find in 1968. The other big context that we have to operate under in this talk is the really powerful impact of two events that are happening in the United States simultaneously. First is the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War, is, of course, as you all well know, going to define much of the 60s, but it really powerfully shapes 1968 and the way young people are responding to the war itself. And in conjunction with that, we have to talk about the Great Society. Right? So the launching of the Great Society in 1965 offered a lot of transformative hope for many Americans and people around the world, looking at Johnson and the Democratic Party as a vehicle for change and transformation. But at the same time, by 1968, that Great Society doesn't seem to be living up to its promises. And so the young people are demanding more rapid action, more profound transformation. So what I want to do tonight is talk about all these things in the context of a chronology, and then we're going to work our way through both the calendar and also talk about different parts of the world. So we're going to be jumping around the world in this talk. We're going to start the conversation in Washington, D.C., early January. And here we have the Janet Rankin Brigade protest of January 15, 1968. For those of you who remember, Janet Rankin was the only congresswoman in this case, to be able to vote against both World War I and World War II. So she was the first elected official, female elected official from Wyoming, and she's going to, Montana, and she's going to be page 83, still pushing this agenda of peace. So about 5,000 women joined her to make this protest, and we're going to try a technology thing here, so just bear with me, because I'm going to have to do this. Just like the fact that I got her voice. So just a quick little clip.
We ought to know that you can't settle a dispute by violence.
Now, next Monday, you plan to lead a group of demonstrators to the Capitol, but the Capitol Police have refused to allow you on the grounds.
And they'll have to let the women come sometime. They might just as well let them come today.
Maybe sometime. But of course, in this context, what they were trying to do was deliver a peace petition. And because of her rank as a former congressperson, she was allowed on the floor. And so she's able to go deliver the petition to the floor and then meet with Mike Mansfield, of course, the famous senator, who had actually defeated her in 1942 after she had voted against going into World War II. So Reagan delivers the platform, or the petition, and then moves off to a hotel just to the west of the Capitol building, where these 5,000 women meet. But several hundred of the young women are going to ultimately, and there's a lot of text, so just read, I won't read it for you, but several hundred of the young women protest within the protest. Right? These are young women who are arguing that the brigade is not radical enough, that they can't just leave petitions and allow for the Congress to push them off and blow them off. Instead, they need to take a more radical approach. And so what they do is they take a coffin with a Barbie doll, a life-size Barbie doll, and march from the Capitol to Arlington Cemetery, where they unceremoniously bury her. They don't actually do the burial, but they deliver her for burial. Now, of course, this is a symbolic image of modern woman, right, the Barbie doll image, and so they're throwing that over. And what they're arguing is, of course, for a more radical egalitarian society, specifically when it comes to gender. And it's directly related to the war effort. So they see their relationship in the context of their gender with the war. That the war is both taking men away to go fight, but it's also leaving women unempowered in the United States. And so they're demanding both more power, but also an end to the war. And so we get with this kind of, it's fairly quiet. It's interesting to note who's there along with Jack Rankin. Coretta Scott King is there, Dagmar Wilson's there. So there are some really powerful figures in the American civil rights movement and women's movement, and yet these feminists are not, they're not going to go along. And this is what's interesting. Young people are basically breaking with the old, and their critique was they're getting too churchy. Right? So the church ladies are kind of running the show. They're too polite, right? They need to move on. And so these women, of course, march on to Arlington. But in many ways, this movement and this march were prophetic because, of course, the war was going to take a very dramatic turn just 2 weeks later. So in 1960, January 30th, 1968, we're going to have the launching of the Tet Offensive. And the Tet Offensive is noted for two things. One, of course, is the scale of the Tet Offensive. The North Vietnamese Army, along with the Viet Cong, are going to engage in military actions all across South Vietnam. You can see some of the actions that you can see pretty much hit every part of South Vietnam. But it's also triggered by a youth movement in its own way. And I don't want to oversell this argument about youth and revolt and making the Viet Cong it's part of that. But in many ways, it is an interesting moment because it is an urban assault. It is young people in South Vietnam who have joined the Viet Cong, rising up and attempting to engage in urban warfare. And this marks a really significant shift in the nature of the Vietnam War. Before it had been in the villages, out in the hinterland, but now it's taken to the cities. And the reason why this is significant is because, of course, when this action begins to take place in cities, it's more easily covered by the United States press. And of course, here you can see a picture of Saigon burning. This image of cities burning is going to be an important one in the 1968 period. Right? All throughout the year, there are these moments of violence in urban environments which are going to lead to scenes like this, right? Scenes of cities burning. We're also, of course, going to get lots more photographs of American soldiers coming back. There's a very high percentage of casualties during this period of time. Thousands more are going to be wounded. This is John Elson. To the left here is John Elson. He's 19 at the time. He's holding his cameras. His cameras had just been hit by a mortar shell, so they were destroyed. But before they were destroyed, he was able to take a picture of Marines retreating on a tank in Hue City. Of course, you can see they're all wounded. Amazingly, every single guy in that photo survived. So that's kind of amazing. And they just had a 50th anniversary. So I found this in a kind of interesting collection of photos. But of course, these are the images that are coming back to the United States that are really going to begin to shape Americans' attitudes toward the war. The anti-war movement, of course, had been already in resistance and had had some significant demonstrations in 1967. But now we're going to start seeing anti-war demonstrations begin to expand pretty dramatically during the 1968 period. Shortly after Tet and the kind of emergence of the conflict, the acceleration of the conflict, we're going to see Robert Kennedy enter the war on a very specific peace message. This is important. He's coming out against the war. He's kind of moving to McCarthy's left and attempting to kind of establish himself as the new light in the Democratic Party. He, of course, had gone on from the Senate and to the Senate, and as a senator had become much more left in his leanings, and was advocating for the Poor People's March, and was working with King on the creation of that. So in many ways, Kennedy takes advantage of the Tet moment, which severely damages Johnson and his credibility, because just a few months before, Johnson had talking about bringing the boy home for Christmas and so forth. So that dream is lost. Westmoreland, of course, is going to ask for 200,000 more troops, and this is going to put Johnson under tremendous political pressure. So much pressure that just a few weeks later, he announces first a halt to bombing north of the 20th parallel. So the really significant bombing campaigns that the United States had launched under Operation Rolling Thunder, where millions of tons of bombs were dropped on North Vietnam, was put to rest for a short period of time under Johnson. And then he slips in this line at the very end of the speech, which is ostensibly about Vietnam, but he then says he's not going to be seeking the nomination for presidency for re-election. And so America kind of stands back in shock. And so, you know, if that's not enough political upheaval for you, that's just the start. So we're not done yet. Things begin to, of course, take a even more radicalizing stance with the Memphis garbage workers strike, which began in February, but lasts until April. And what's significant about the Memphis strike is two things. One, it is, again, this kind of emergence of younger people. Even though the actual sanitation workers were a little bit older, they are going to attract younger support for the workers. The American Union movement is going to get involved for the first time actively in the civil rights movement, and so we're going to have AFSCME willing to take on this question. Up until this point, African Americans have found very little home within the AFL-CIO, but now AFSCME is going to jump out. And then, of course, it conjoins with King's new agenda of economic transformation. He moved not just, he don't say past civil rights, but he was saying as part of civil rights, we have to add a socioeconomic component. And as you may know, he had tried to do different things, such as the housing question in Chicago, and he had begun to associate himself with the labor movement, and specifically the poverty marches. So King is kind of reasserting his position here. King had had a serious ding to his reputation, of course, because he had come out against the Vietnam War. And so, in many ways, he's reasserting his position in both the American political scene, within the civil rights movement, and also connecting himself to the labor movement. Of course, the strike goes on for about almost 2 months, and but is marred by some really distinct events. Most notably, the first march that King is going to lead. Here you have a picture of the violence. This is a very specific picture of Leslie Dean Jones, a police officer, who's eventually going to end up killing Larry Payne there, the young man in the white shirt, age 16. So again, youth in revolt, both in the context of the garbage worker strike, but also in the context of challenging King. Because this march, in March 28, 1968, is the only march in King's long history of marching which ended up violent. And the reason for this is that the King and his colleagues in the SCLC were unable to control the young people who had become more radicalized and wanted and demanded more rights right now. And they were willing to take on the police. Now, in this context, foolishly, but we're going to see, right, the willingness of African Americans, Americans, Parisians, Czechoslovakians. They're going to be willing to take on the police. This is a significant shift in American attitudes towards authority and police figures, and it's going to turn out quite badly, not just for people like Larry King, but for plenty of other people going forward. But King himself, of course, is absolutely shocked by this. Never in his life had a march gone sour, if you would, right, where the police had to react. And so King comes back a week later. He wants to go to the funeral of Larry Payne. He's not able to do that. He wasn't able to get back in time for that, but he was able to get back to Memphis to organize a second march. But of course, as you well know, on the day of the march, he was assassinated. So King is assassinated at this key moment when he's attempting to reassert nonviolence as a means of protest in America. And the consequence of this, of course, is quite powerful. Right? The death of King unleashes a fury in America that is going to be unmatched, I think, in terms of its violence. And here I wanted to stop and just say this is a really interesting scene from Vietnam, Washington. Of course, there's rioting all across the United States, but most famously, there's significant rioting in Anacostia and in other parts of Washington. Washington, of course, was an African-American city. And so Johnson is literally sitting in the Oval Office looking across and seeing his city burn. Right? The idea of urban violence, which we've just seen in places like Hue and Saigon, have now come back to haunt the United States. This rioting is going to take place in Newark, in Detroit, and elsewhere across the country. The response, of course, is pent-up frustration with the American government, the inability of the American government to protect King and to prevent his assassination leads African American communities to riot all across the country. Now, that rioting was about the King assassination, but it's also important to note that students are beginning to get organized to protest against the Vietnam War. And so just at the same time that these riots are happening in African American communities in places like Newark and Detroit, we're also going to see in New York City at an Ivy League school. Right? So again, remember I said this is not about class, because these youth revolts are going to happen at all levels of society, whether it's poor African Americans or really, really privileged whites. We're going to see them all pushing back. And of course, in this case, they're pushing back against the administration willingness to work with the United States military, and specifically the United States Army, on some research projects. And so they're there to protest the Vietnam War in a general way, and then a very specific protest against Colombia's willingness to work with the military. So they occupy a number of buildings in and around Columbia University. Here's Mark Rudd, of course, from the Students for the Democratic Society. This is an organization that had organized earlier in the 1960s and had, of course, released a manifesto. What's it? So they had released a manifesto calling for a better world. But by 1968, they're kind of pushing back against their nonviolent agenda and starting to assert more aggressive forms of protest. Of course, ultimately, on April 30th, 1968, the police are sent in, and it's a pretty violent affair. So just to give you some numbers, there's, let's see how many years. 132 students were injured, 4 faculty, and 12 police officers, with 700 arrests. So we're talking about really large-scale protest. So we start with 5,000 women in January. Now we're talking about thousands upon thousands of students entering into Columbia to occupy the buildings. And ultimately, of course, they're going to be thrown out and arrested. But what you're going to get another theme of 1968 is that for all the youth revolt, for all the willingness of young people to come out into the streets and engage in protests and demand more egalitarian society, there's always going to be a repressive force willing to use repression against them, whether it's police violence or even more aggressive violence than that. So whether you're in Memphis, whether you're in New York City, whether you're in New York or Washington, D.C., there's a really powerful repressive force that's willing to come back and get you. Now, what happens in Paris just a few weeks later is connected in one way because of the question of Vietnam. The French, of course, had their own Vietnam experience, which had lingered and powerfully impacted on them. They also, of course, had their experience in Algeria. And so many young people in Paris were protesting against global imperialism, challenges of American and French involvement in Vietnam. They were also seeing the protests in the United States, especially at Columbia, and seeing the connections. And so on May 6, 1968, 5,000 students decided to march against the French university system, which they saw as incredibly repressive, misogynistic, and classist, which, by the way, it still is. But in 1968, you can see these young people rising up, trying to push back against that system, demanding a change. They're also pushing back against de Gaulle. And the reason why, of course, they're pushing against de Gaulle had come to power in 1958 in the midst of the Algerian War, had imposed a very, very powerful, very strong authoritarian presidency over the people, and had really never really given up the reins. Charles de Gaulle was not one to give up the reins for anything. And so when they're protesting, de Gaulle says, well, you know, we have to show them a response that matches their protesting. I mean, I want you to think about it. These are young people, they're marching in the Latin Quarter. They're not doing anything particularly bad, but they're going to be bad with the police. With the violence that ensues is going to lead to hundreds hospitalized and hundreds more arrested. So the people of France witnessed this incredible police repression of these young people. And what's striking is what happens next, which is, I shouldn't say striking, but is a strike. A week later, after the police engaged in this battle, we're going to have a general strike. Now, just to give you a sense of what a general strike means in France, that means 9 million workers walked off the job. That was 2/3 of the French workforce walked off the job. Now that's kind of mind-blowing, right? To think about it. Of course, that brings the entirety of France down. And what's interesting, of course, is you can see French nationalism at its height. This is the tricolor. This is 1871. This is Jean Valjean. This is Marx and Rabelais. And so I wanted to show a video which I think captures some of this in a nice little remembrance. Okay. Where'd it go? Yes, there's one I don't have.
The Columbia strike may have reminded people of the Paris Commune, but May '68 in France was the real thing. What began as a student protest for reform of the archaic, authoritarian French university system sparked a general strike that electrified the country.
They were anarchists, most of them. That was the spirit. The slogan was all power to the imagination. That you can do anything. You know, we don't have to live with all the various forms of repression, which we're used to. So it was anti-capitalist, but that was just part of this general, complete sort of cultural revolution that the French students were anticipating. And so it's interesting that although they were the furthest out in any way politically, that was also the one place where workers joined with students and almost toppled the government.
May 10th, the night of the barricades, 20,000 students marched in the Latin Quarter. Police and students clashed, street fighting went on for weeks. The rioting and marches of up to 500,000 people frightened not only President de Gaulle, but the French Communist Party as well. The old left thought this new left was out of control. They had impossible dreams.
The two principal slogans, I think, were quotations from Marx and Revolt. From Marx, let us change the world. From Revolt, let us change life.
Carlos Fuentes, the Mexican novelist, was an active participant in May '68, along with many international students caught up in the excitement.
What there was is a sense of extraordinary brotherhood and sisterhood. There was this capacity to embrace people in the streets. There were couples kissing. There were couples that fell apart because they did not share political views. Paris was divided by the River Seine as never before. On the left bank, you had the left, the revolutionaries, the dreamers. On the right side, you had the conservatives, you had the Gaullists, you had the financiers, the money people, the bourgeoisie. So the city was divided as much as in Les Miserables and Victor Hugo or in any of the great occasions of this city that seems to need a great revolutionary explosion from time to time.
Eventually, the May uprising subsided. The powerful trade unions controlled by the communists refused to take part, and police kept up relentless pressure. But over time, the students did succeed in reforming and modernizing the French educational system, and they rejuvenated the Socialist Party, which a decade later became the elected government of France.
It became a great, gigantic fraternal feast in which everybody was kissing everybody, embracing everybody, patting everybody on the back, and saying how happy they were and how free they felt. And this was contagious. It was marvelous, and I don't think we'll ever see it again.
But what's important to get a hold of here in the context of the Parisian uprising, and it was really a general strike across France, is that the young people, again, outstretched the old political parties, right? You hear this language of the communists unwilling to work with the left here. It's dangerous to let me do anything with technology. My students with Amber don't will vouch for that. But here's a bit of Parisian graffiti, which I think actually captures the feelings of the moment, but also this kind of idea, those who make revolutions halfway only dig their own graves. And that sentiment is interesting because, of course, the revolution is fundamentally put down. It's put down partly from the repressive Gaullist regime, but it's also put down because ultimately the left itself couldn't come together and become unified. And while it's a documentary that says that nice things happened to France afterwards, those reforms didn't necessarily transform France into a much more egalitarian society. And there's still lots of challenges facing them today, but we don't need to go into that as much. But what I want you to think about is that many of the goals that they had established in May 6th of 1968 are not accomplished in 1968, and rather, de Gaulle survives. De Gaulle not only is going to return, he actually escaped Paris during the risings, but he returns from a French military base in Germany and asserts himself in this June 7, 1968 television interview. It's interesting, it's striking that he presents himself in this way. How he had presented himself to the French people in previous crises in 1958 and 1960, of course, as he had donned his military uniform. But in this case, he's just wearing a suit, but he's still the old, you almost get a sense of, de Gaulle was a great speaker. He always had the hand gestures, right? So he can't control himself, even when he's seated. So in many ways, this was a revolution undone. But at the same time, it inspired lots and lots of other people to engage in other activities. Unfortunately, one of those activities was politics, and Bobby Kennedy was assassinated on June 5th, 1968. Again, a blow to Americans that were looking for a leader from the left. Of course, the blow of King's death combined with the blow of Kennedy's death is a real serious blow to both the civil rights movement and to the anti-poverty movement, which was at this time trying to organize the Poor People's March. And so, in many ways, Americans are deflated, at least on the left. But most the young people on the left take this blow and begin to push back against it. But at the same time that this is happening in the United States and in France, we also have what we think of as the Prague Spring. And what happens here is that the Czechs reorganize themselves politically. The Communist Party in Czechoslovakia reorganizes itself in the beginnings of 1968. And then through this reorganizational process in which they establish two states, the Czech Republic and the Slovakian Republic, and basically that language of Czechoslovakia comes into a real division. By doing this, they're actually diffusing power down to the local government. And this is about decentralizing power. Now, part of what Dudeček is doing is also de-Stalinizing, right? So this is in 15 years after the end of Stalin, and so they're pulling away some of the more heavy-handed apparatchik. But what ends up happening as a result of this transformation is an opening of the mind. And so young people in Czechoslovakia take this new release, this decentralizing of power, this kind of removal of the police, watch, basically this kind of constant supervision, the overwatch that the state had engaged in for decades. Now, this pulling back from that, it allows them to engage in other kinds of activities, writing poems, writing plays. So many of the great Czech and Slovakian playwrights at this time are going to start being able to air their ideas. And they're going to be able to begin to critique socialism, which people really didn't get to do in the Soviet Union or in the Warsaw Pact states. And in this process of having conversations about Marxism and about communism, they begin to challenge the fundamental structures of the Soviet Union. They demand more liberty, they demand more cultural rights, and they start to embrace some of these Western ideas that have been percolating over from the United States and France, right? This language about live in the imagination, right? So engage in cultural revolution. I decided not to get heavily into this, but I realized that the word cultural revolution continues to come up. And of course, they're also being influenced by a cultural revolution that's taking place in China. And that's a little bit beyond the scope of this talk. But that cultural revolution is influencing the idea of having a cultural revolution in Eastern Europe. And so the Czechs are going to demand more freedom, more rights, more reforms. But ultimately, in August, the Soviet Union is going to respond with Russian troops and troops from the Warsaw Pact driving in to Prague and to all of Czechoslovakia. And what's really striking about this is that when it's the youth that lead the party apparatus. The party apparatus is basically arrested. Dudeček basically makes a deal with Brezhnev to kind of pull back on the reforms, allowing him to maintain political power without having to necessarily sacrifice too many lives. But what's striking is the young people reject that. They reject this agreement that Dudeček makes, and they go out in the street. And for the next several months, they're going to attempt nonviolence as the vehicle. There you can see that they're talking to the Russian troops. They're bringing out the troop couleur, which is also the colors of the Czech flag. They're out there confronting these soldiers in ways these are non-Czech, these are not Czechs, these are not Slovaks, these are not people who are speaking their language, and yet they're willing to stand in front of them. And they're living 12 years after the repression of the Hungarian revolt, and so they know what the Soviets are capable of, and yet they were still willing to go out in the streets. But knowing what the Soviets are capable of course, is that the Soviets are not going to back down. And you can put as many laurel leaves on tanks as you want. The tanks are ultimately going to be able to smash your buildings, your infrastructure, and ultimately you can kind of see that community watching. So by the end of September, early October, the Czech spring is over, and one more 1968 youth revolt has come to an end. Getting the president, sorry. It doesn't get much better. But then we get to Evansville. Yes, I was told I had to include something about Evansville. And it just so happened that, yes, even Evansville had a youth revolt. Except this one was not what we would think of as a leftist youth revolt. Rather, this was a revolt by whites, students, young white people, who traversed into the Lincoln-Grosvenor area and shot arrows and later guns at the African American community there. And while this is a riot, a race riot, in every sense of the way, it's about race, it's never fully articulated by the people who are committing it what they're about. But I'm going to suss out what this is about. So here you can see, this is on day 2 of the rioting. The city, of course, puts on a curfew. So this is the empty streets of Evansville. And there's also this rainstorm, and of course, this massive tea storm. We've all been here for tea storms. So we know what those massive tea storms are like. And they attribute the massive tea storm to putting the riot out, because nobody wanted to be out in the bad weather. So by Sunday, the day after this, so the Monday, the 26th, the riot is over. And the question is, what was it all about? There were a number of arrests. Almost all the people who were arrested were African Americans. They were arrested, of course, for throwing rocks and bricks at passing cars, which were occupied by white young people who were engaging in these either verbal engagements or actually shooting arrows and later guns at the community, the African American community. So you're always trying to figure out how you connect all this together. And in many ways, this story flips the script on youth revolt and actually talks about youth engaging in repression. Because the next day, the Evansville School Board announces that it will put off its integration plan until 1970. So while it's hard to, nobody wrote this up and I haven't found anybody saying young people in Evansville were protesting against immigration, it's kind of clear who was protesting against what, even if they weren't able to articulate it in the newspaper. And the way the newspaper responds to it is very kind of, they don't understand this either, right? They think it's just hooliganism but I think it really connects to this language of repression and resistance in Evansville to the idea of an integrated system. Right? And so the school board pushes the integration plan off for 2 years, which I think is quite striking. So Evansville fits into the story, but it fits in a kind of awkward way that makes us not so proud. But the young people didn't stop. They weren't done. At the very same time that whites were attacking blacks in Evansville, we're going to see a community of whites and blacks coming together in Chicago to protest against the Democratic National Convention, which is organizing a presidential candidate for 1968. So here you see the Grant Park occupied by the students. Tens of thousands of students are going to occupy the park. They're actually quite disciplined. The yippies, and these are the yippies, not the hippies, and the yippies are actually really quite organized. And they set up a camp community and get themselves organized with food, drink, and other stuff. And are having a bit of a good time of it. And they're also marching pretty effectively. And so this is unacceptable to Mayor Daley and the Democrats. And so eventually, as you know, Mr. Daley decides on August 28th that this must end. And so the Chicago police engaged in mass arrest with the clearance of Grant Park. And what's important about this violence, of course, is that it reflects badly both on the police, but also on the hippies themselves, because, of course, if you're anti-young hippie type characters, you're going to find them to be, violent and unwilling to follow the law. But if you're watching the police, if you're from the young perspective, you're watching the police and their violence, it's completely excessive. And they arrest not just lots of individuals, but they arrest what becomes known as the Chicago 8. And it says you can't jail the revolution, stop the trial, free the conspiracy 8. Here are a couple of the members of the Chicago 8. Now hopefully there's someone in this room that's saying, wait a second, Dr. Byrne, that's not what they're called. The Chicago 7. And why is that? Because what ends up happening, of course, is the prosecutor, in the midst of trying to successfully prosecute the conspiracy 8, they get rid of Bobby Seale. They don't want a black guy in the mix, so it's 7 white guys that they're going to have. And so by pulling Bobby Seale and prosecuting him separately, right, it becomes the Chicago 7. Right? And it's really quite interesting how the Chicago prosecutors are going to use race as a vehicle, right? Because what they're trying to do is discredit people like Tom Hayden, Jerry Rubin, Abby Hoffman, these radical lefts. But if you merge the language of radical right, of the radical African American community, the Black Panthers, and others, into that story, then you've got an integrationist story. And that's not acceptable to the Chicago prosecutors. And so ultimately, they're going to be prosecuted separately. I think it's also really interesting how they're prosecuted. They're prosecuted by federal prosecutors, which is interesting, under this 1968 Civil Rights Act. Now you might say to yourself, that seems quite odd. Why would they be? Well, the 1968 Civil Rights Act said it was illegal, it was against federal law, to travel across state borders to engage in civil protest. Now what they were trying to do, not civil protest, violent protest, right, because these guys are supposedly involved in themselves in violence. What they were trying to do, of course, was stop the Klan from traveling across state lines to engage in activities. But ultimately, right, they're going to prosecute the Chicago 8 for that. Ultimately, all of their convictions were overturned, and they're going to be freed. But not in 68. In 1968, these guys are all in jail. Right? The repressive man wins again. Right? Because you can jail the revolution. At the very same time that Evansville and Chicago are in upheaval, we're also, of course, going to see the student protests in Mexico. And the student protests in Mexico are about education and reform of education, but they're also about one-party rule. The PRI had been in power since the Mexican Revolution and were very repressive and uninterested in democracy. And so the students are both embracing education reform, but also democratic reform. But, of course, the Mexican government was, as you've already seen, right, this is the nonviolent part of the protest. And here you already see they're using armed vehicles, they're out in force. And, of course, ultimately, as these protests continue, and these went on for many months, in Tlaxcala Square, which is the center of Mexico City. So on October 2nd, after over a month and a half of protest, the police eventually take action. In this case, they also bring in the Mexican army. And one of the things we find is that whenever you bring in military forces, they almost always fail to maintain discipline, and of course what that leads to is death. And so unlike some of our previous examples, where we talked about people being, we had one murder in Memphis, we had mostly lots of injuries, now we have straight out slaughter. And of course the reason why they're doing this on October 2nd, 1968, is because the Mexican government is preparing to bring the world to Mexico City. And so roughly 300 to 400 students were killed, thousands were arrested, and this was all disappeared. Hardly anyone reported on this. The national reporting, of course, was zero. Mexico Internationally, it wasn't reported on because everybody was focused on the Mexican Olympics. But of course, as we know, in 1968, young people weren't done yet. They weren't done protesting, no matter whether you had killed them, slaughtered them, pushed them back, arrested them. It didn't matter. They were still going to protest. And of course, those protests will take the form of the Black Power salute by Tommie Smith and John Carlos, just a few days into the Olympics itself. And I want to see if I have this other. This is we know that everybody knows this, right? This is a symbol, right? The Black Power's symbol gets them expelled. They lose their medals. But one of the things we don't know much about is a young Czech gymnast who is going to win a silver medal and a gold medal. And I think actually she won 2 silvers and a gold. And in both of the medal ceremonies, the Soviet gymnast has either had the gold or the silver. And in both cases, when the Soviet anthem is played, she turns her head. I just want you to watch.
And again, she has turned her head to the right and down, just as she did at the last ceremony. This does not appear to be an accident.
You're looking at the woman that was my hero in '68. We're friends now, and I know the pain that she felt. I think the whole world knew.
And we don't really know the story, right?
Or the War and Peace Report. I mean, Goodman with Nermeen Sheikh.
We turn now to a new memoir by the International...
We don't really know the story, right, of, let me make sure I get the name correct, Vera Kasalatska, who goes home to the Czech Republic in 1968 and is a hero to the Czechs, but not to the Soviets. And she's going to find that she's going to have a hard time maintaining her role as a gymnast in the Soviet sports world. And even though the Czech gymnast team had won the 1967 European Cups, so they had performed, she will not be able to do as much. And so she finds herself really pushed out of the Soviet sports system. So it's really, like, people were willing to take strong stance. The youth were not done, and they were willing to do it on the world stage in this powerful moment and sacrifice their careers, sacrifice their medals, sacrifice their friendship, and many other things. So, how does it all come together? Well, at the end of the day, the youth may be in revolt, but the Republican Party is going to engage in a political campaign that is going to push for law and order. And I mean, I'm sure there's a sense of reminiscence, this language coming back in our society. But Nixon embodies this idea of law and order, the strong president that's going to come back and lead the American people away from 1968, this year of turmoil, this year of young people in revolt, this year of political and economic and social turmoil. Of course, I always love this. I'm sure Bill always loves to do this stuff. Oh, it just looks like a landslide, doesn't it? I mean, man, did Nixon win. That's awesome. Right? The reality is he did win. He won the Electoral College. But he only won 43.2% of the vote, which is interesting to think about here. He's a plurality president. The next year, he's going to be talking about the silent majority, that he stands for the silent majority. But in reality, of course, the silent majority didn't vote. Or if they did, they voted for people like Humphrey and Wallace. So the Democrats, of course, fall upon themselves, as they often do. And as a result, Wallace takes 12.9% of Dixieland with them, and of course that leads to of Humphrey. Of course, we can never say what the future would have brought, but if Wallace doesn't take Dixieland with him, they win the election, the electoral college. So, it's important to remember that we've had these plurality presidencies, we've got a plurality president right now, and there's nothing new with it. But in both cases, in the context of 1968 and of course in 2016, that president claims a mandate post-election. Right? And of course Nixon does that very powerfully in 1969 when he says the majority of Americans are with me, and there's no proof of that in the polls. So Nixon wins, he's quite happy. You can see the character is your qualifications. Character is, here comes the prez. So 1968 ends on a kind of depressing note if you were one of these young people who have attempted to create a more egalitarian society, to overthrow the patriarchy, to overthrow the hierarchy, to transform education, to challenge misogyny and racism. None of it seems to have worked. None of it seems to have ended well for anyone. But one of the things we always talk about with history is that history doesn't end on a particular date. We don't mark high water, we might mark high water and low water, but we don't mark endpoints. And because history has a tendency to keep going. And because of that, I'm going to end with this. So, 50 years later, we're still marching. Young people are still in revolt. And we'll see you later. So thanks very much.